Welcome back to the parillaworks channel. My name is John. I built my first Apothecary cabinet about 2 years ago. There was still one piece of quartersawn sapele left, so I figured it would be a good idea to make something to complement the Apothecary cabinet, which is in the entryway of our house. I dug the piece out and started the normal milling process. This was an 8/4 board about 8 inches wide by 9 feet long, and it ended up being just enough material for this cabinet. I jointed one face and one edge, then resawed the boards into thinner boards. My original plan was to have an outer case made of 3/4 inch thick material with inner dividers at a 1/2 inch thick. I decided to lighten the look of the piece and dropped both thicknesses down by 1/8 of an inch, which means the outer case was 5/8 of an inch thick and the inner dividers were 3/8 of an inch thick. All that to say, I did waste some material, but it was due to a design choice I made on the fly. I milled the resawed boards over the course of 2 sessions to ensure the boards wouldn't twist on me too much. Luckily, this material was quite stable, so I didn't have too much movement. I used a drum sander to bring the inner dividers down to a precise thickness that would fit into routed dados. These dados would be routed with a 3/8 inch pattern bit. Next, I could cut the material to its final width and length at the table saw. As is typical, I'm using the dowel max to join the outer case pieces. I've added the 1/4 inch bushings since this material is only 5/8 of an inch thick. A combination of shims is used to center on the material perfectly. Each corner is held together by 6 dowels, which should be plenty strong to hold this thing together. When drilling into the face of the boards, I like to add a 1/16 of an inch shim, which gives me a slight overhang that I can easily flush up later on. When all of the holes are drilled, I like to do a test fit using about half of the dowels, because using all of them could make the pieces hard to get apart. The inner dividers create a combination of drawer cubbies and shelving space. These dividers were going to be held together using stop dados. I used 2 different spacers to keep all of the dados lined up perfectly. The design of this cabinet revolves around 9-inch squares, and that 9 inches, along with the 3/8 inch thick dividers, meant my crucial spacers were 9 inches wide and 4 and 5/16 inches wide. I routed the dados by running a 3/8 inch pattern bit along the spacers. Dados in the outer casework were a 1/4 inch deep, while those in the inner dividers were only 1/8 of an inch deep. The dados are stopped 3/4 of an inch shy of the front edge, and in the end, these inner dividers will be inset a 1/2 inch from the outer casework, which gives some added depth. This part of the build was a series of routing dados and cutting pieces to length. I started by routing dados for the vertical dividers, and then cut those dividers to length by measuring off my workpiece, rather than my drawing. Next, I routed dados into those vertical dividers, which would house the horizontal dividers. And lastly, I routed and cut for the small middle vertical divider. In total, there were 22 dados to route. This didn't take too long, but I made sure to take my time so I could avoid any mix-ups. I had each panel labeled so that I knew the arrangement of cuts it required. The narrow width and shallow depth of cuts also made them relatively easy and quick to At this point, the stop dados have a rounded end. To fix that, I used a chisel to square everything up. This was my first time doing this type of joinery, and I had to say it was pretty fun and relaxing to get some hand tool work done. To hide the dados and add some strength, I added a haunch to the ends of the dividers. This is essentially a little notch that gives the dado some more glue surface. I did this at the table saw using a flat bottom grind blade, and plenty of test cuts were done before getting to the real thing. In the end, all the dividers fit really nice and the front edges were perfectly flush. The last major step before the glue up was to route a rabbet to house the back panel and French cleat. In total, I wanted the rabbet to be a 1/4 inch deep by 1 inch wide. I used a 1/2 inch spiral bit to complete the rabbet in 2 passes with the help of an edge guide. The top and bottom pieces received stop dados, while the sides could get through dados. I made sure to do all 4 pieces at my original edge guide setting before making any adjustments. Once they were routed, I squared up the ends with a chisel. These dados did run into the last dowel joint somewhat, but it wasn't too much of an issue. The glue up went pretty well and hassle-free. I sanded all of the parts up to 220 grit and raised the grain because I knew it would be tough to get any sanding done once everything was assembled. I used Titebond 2 Extend because it has a longer open time than the typical Titebond glues. I glued this up in much the same order that I made it, starting with the outer case, then the vertical dividers, and onto the horizontal pieces. I used 15 or so clamps to make sure everything was held together tightly. Now that the case was done, I could move on to the 8 little drawers. I spent a decent amount of time trying to find the right piece of wood to be the drawer fronts. I've been saving 2 small pieces of walnut for a few years because they have very white sapwood, which is rare for the lumber I buy. I think that means it's air dried, but I'm not 100% sure. I like the extreme contrast and was saving them for the right project. My plan was to run the grain of the wood vertically. This way I could do a book match of the wood, and if I went horizontally, there wouldn't be much of a pattern to show off. The main drawer boxes were made from maple, which I planed down to a 1/4 inch thick. I generally don't go this thin on drawer parts, but I wanted to try it out and figured these drawers wouldn't be used too often, so strength wasn't a big concern. The drawers are designed to fit the cubby perfectly, and we'll use the back panel as a stop so that they sit flush with the dividers. The bottom panel is plywood and sits in a groove I cut at the table saw. I didn't bother with any fancy joinery on these drawers, just old-fashioned butt joints. I was torn on how to arrange the grain of the walnut drawer fronts. I could either have the sapwood facing in or facing out. I decided to go with it facing in and glued the pieces on accordingly. I used a plywood caul to apply pressure evenly, and I don't expect much issue with conflicting grain directions here because these pieces are fairly thin. With the main components of the project made, I could move on to some cleanup work. This included flushing up that 16th inch overhang, sanding, and adding some edge profiles. The outer case received an 1/8 inch roundover, while the inner divider's edges were eased with sandpaper. The drawers also received 1/8 inch roundovers. I applied 3 coats of Danish oil. The biggest key to this type of finish is to completely wipe off the excess. Letting extra oil sit on the surface will just turn the piece sticky and will require extra cleanup. Sometimes I'll sand between coats if there are any rough spots that show up. I wanted to go a different route with the back panel. Typically, I would use a 1/4 inch panel made of sapele here, but I decided to use fabric. My wife and I usually have conflicting opinions on choices like this, but we were able to come to an agreement on this fabric. I stapled it to the 1/2 inch plywood back panel, making sure to tighten up any slack along the way. I'm a big fan of Matt Kenny, and he uses fabric in his little boxes from time to time, so this was heavily inspired by his work. I think this is one of those love it or hate it type designs, but I love it. The last finishing touches were the drawer handles and some hooks. The finish on the hardware didn't match, so I spray painted them with a matte metallic paint. I made a simple template to drill all of the holes on the drawers accurately. There are 3 hooks on the bottom of the cabinet to hold bags, and 2 in the far right cubby to hold keys. And finally, I could hang it on the wall using a French cleat. I tried to challenge myself when designing this project. I used thinner material for a lighter look and inset the inner dividers for some added depth. Stop dados were not as daunting as I had thought they would be, and I think they're a much cleaner look than the through dados I've used on previous Apothecary pieces. I'm glad I saved this piece of walnut because it ended up being perfect for this project. The use of fabric in the back panel turned out better than I had expected. I thought it would compete with the walnut too much, but I think everything plays together just fine. This piece is intended to be visually pleasing but also functional. The hooks will allow us to hang bags and keys, while the cabinet itself complements the other pieces in our entryway. If you're interested in projects like this while they're in progress, follow me on Instagram. My handle is @parillaworks. Until next time, thanks for watching.